Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eri Kim. A little bit about me and what I do. I'm 24 years old. I'm a second generation Korean American, and I work for a few Korean American organizations here in New York, which also happens to be where I was born and raised. I currently serve as one of the senior VPs of the Korean American Association of Greater New York. I'm also a program coordinator for the Korean American Youth Foundation's We Are Future Leaders High School Empowerment Program. And I am currently a second-year master's student at NYU in the East Asian Studies department. So suffice it to say, I've got a lot of Korean-related stuff going on in my life, and it's important to me because I am a Korean American. In my experience, being a Korean American comes with a lot of self-reflection and grappling with one's identity. And the way that I've seen it, understanding your identity, it isn't just about the way you perceive yourself, but also the way you are perceived by others. When I think about what a Korean American existence means to me, one word comes to mind: liminality. Liminality, it denotes a status of ambiguity, a state of transition. It's all about in-betweenness, being in between two identities, the way you understand yourself. So what liminality means to me, it's the state of being in between identities, right? I'm not 50% Korean, I'm not 50% American, I'm not split down the middle. Rather, my ethnic identity, it's defined by the hyphen that bridges those two parts of myself. But having a liminal identity, it means that you are ambiguous. And if your identity is ambiguous, people don't really know what to make of you. And if people don't know what to make of you, or don't know what boxes to put you in, it's really easy for one to experience a sense of instability in your identity, or an identity crisis, if you like. I've spent my whole life surrounded by other Korean people, whether we're talking about my own family members, people at school, church, or working with the Korean community. And in my experience, what I've observed in my community is that we haven't quite critically examined a tendency to police other people's identities or gatekeep who is or is not Korean enough. We've seen it before. Real Koreans speak Korean fluently. Real Koreans serve in the military. Real Koreans look, behave, and present themselves as Koreans, right? As a second-gen Korean, this means that I was born and raised in the US and I speak English as my first language. And as a second-gen, I've experienced this kind of identity policing pretty much my entire life. As with everything in this world, it all starts in childhood. I recall being very young and my grandfather bemoaning to a room of his sons and his daughters-in-law about what a shame it is that none of his grandkids could speak Korean. I can still feel the heat on my face when family members would shade me for not being able to speak Korean properly, and the frustration that I felt that I could understand everything that they were saying, but I just couldn't respond the way that I really wanted to. I also remember being in school with my Korean friends, and they would poke fun at me for the weird way that I would say Korean words, for my strange pronunciation, and they would call me a Twinkie, which would aggravate me to no end. And for those of you that don't know, a Twinkie is basically like the Hostess pastry. You're yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And to this day, I do get triggered by other Asians, especially other Korean people, that call me whitewashed or that I'm basically white. And if you look at this face, I'm clearly not a white person. So I think that the gatekeeping I had experienced all my life of being told I wasn't Korean enough, or that I was whitewashed or too American to have any ownership over a Korean identity, it had given me a new resolve. It's like my brain went, You know what? Screw you guys. I'm going to learn Korean and speak it so well that you are fully shocked that I articulate myself so well, right? And I'm going to learn everything that I can about Korea so that none of you can tell me that I don't know anything about my culture. When I put it in those terms, I admit that it sounds like I started this journey of discovering my heritage out of pure spite towards other Koreans who told me I wasn't Korean enough. And maybe that's my Han, my felt humiliation, or this bottled up resentment that I had over the frustration of not being able to communicate with others the way that I had desperately wanted to, and the experiences of my Korean identity being denied by others. And so I set out to learn anything that I could about my Korean heritage, from reading Korean literature to gaining an intimate understanding of post-colonial Korea's social and political situations. But my outlook on what it means to be a Korean person changed completely once I had begun to educate myself about the diaspora. For me, it starts with learning about the ethnic Korean community in Japan. As I read literature by people like Kim Sa-ryang, Lee Yang-ji, Kaneshiro Kazuki, it occurred to me that while the struggles of Zainichi Koreans were not identical to my own experiences, I resonated so deeply with the way that these folks grappled with a Korean identity and what that meant to them. To be Korean in a place that was not your homeland, to be a Korean person navigating 2 or more cultures, struggling to have a stable sense of ownership over a Korean identity. There are Koreans virtually on every single continent on this earth, except for Antarctica, from the Koryoin in Central Asia, to the Korean Chinese folks, to the ethnic Korean communities in South America. We are everywhere, and we've all found ways of redefining and adapting our ethnic identities wherever we ended up in the world. Discovering the diaspora had prompted a question in my head that I'm still thinking about today. What exactly makes a Korean person Korean? Because if we are to define it by the languages that we speak, the food that we eat, or where we grew up, nobody who calls themselves Korean is going to give the same answer. And so what I've learned from my studies and from meeting other Koreans of the diaspora is that culture is ever evolving. It's never static, it's constantly in motion. And for so long, I had thought that through my studies, through learning and practicing my Korean, through surrounding myself with other Korean people, that I could somehow perfect my Koreanness and master my own identity and heritage. But what I discovered upon learning about the diaspora is that there are so many others like me who understand what Korean means to them in their own unique ways, and who come from a multitude of experiences. There's no one way of living a Korean life. And I say this all the time, as many Koreans there are in this world, there are that many ways of being a Korean person. And there's immense beauty and joy in the diversity of our experiences. So Korea is the diaspora. And what I mean by this is that if we did not immigrate outside of the peninsula, a Korean identity probably would not have been born in the first place. And the most beautiful part of the Korean diaspora is the way that we've taken our roots and innovated these identities into something new. I truly believe that it speaks to the resilience of the Korean people. Many of us have to navigate being a minority in a new society, right? But we're able to adapt to these new environments and to these challenges while still maintaining a deep sense of pride in our shared roots. And you know, these days I work with high school students as part of the Korean American Youth Foundation's Youth Empowerment Program. And I have the distinct honor and privilege of working with these amazing students that are from all over America. And they come from really diverse backgrounds as well. Some of them are 3rd and 4th generation. Some of them come from multicultural families. Some of them speak languages other than English and Korean at home. And they're at their age where I was struggling with feeling Korean enough. And so maybe this is kind of me trying to retroactively fix my childhood or my adolescence, but I constantly tell them that there's no right or correct way of being a Korean person. They just are. And just to reiterate, for as many Koreans there are in this world, there are that many ways of expressing a Korean identity. To be a Korean of the diaspora, it often means a liminal existence, an identity of in-betweens. Take it from me. I used to struggle with a lot of internalized self-hatred as an Asian person and also feeling like I would never be Korean enough. But the greatest gift that I received from the Korean diaspora is a completely new understanding of myself. Living between two cultures and grappling with the labels of Korean and American doesn't have to be a disempowering or a negative experience. If anything, what liminality means to me now is being comfortable in that in-betweenness and even feeling empowered by it. And that's what makes me who I am, and my experience is just one of the many, many diverse ways of being a Korean person in this world. Thank you.